Karen, what in the hell are you doing in my pool? Jim's voice carried the barely contained fury of a man who'd been woken up by his son saying, "Dad, the HOA lady is swimming in her suit." Karen straightened her shoulders, summoning every ounce of authority she'd cultivated over 3 years of micromanaging mailbox heights and flower bed regulations. "I'm conducting an emergency health inspection. Your pool has a severe algae problem that threatens the entire neighborhood's property values." Sarah stopped recording and looked at her pool, then back at Karen. "Our pool guy was here yesterday. That water is crystal clear." Karen glanced at the pool, which was indeed sparkling in the morning sun. The green tint she'd been so certain about had apparently been a trick of evening shadows and her own desperate need to find violations. But admitting error wasn't in Karen's vocabulary. "The algae is microscopic," she said confidently. "Invisible to the untrained eye. I have specialized equipment." She held up the pH testing kit, which had somehow survived her aquatic adventure. Jim took a step closer. "Get out of my yard. Now. Not until you sign this violation notice and agree to proper pool maintenance protocols." "Karen," Sarah said, her voice taking on the patience typically reserved for dealing with toddlers having meltdowns in grocery stores. "You broke into our property and jumped in our pool. We have it all on camera." She gestured to the obvious security cameras mounted around the patio area. For the first time, doubt flickered across Karen's face. She'd been so focused on gathering evidence that she hadn't considered she might be creating evidence against herself. But her years of HOA presidency had taught her that retreat was never an option. "Those cameras will clearly show that I followed proper inspection protocols. I'll be filing a formal complaint about your pool maintenance and your hostile attitude toward community wellness." She marched toward the gate, leaving a trail of chlorinated water, her head held high despite the squelching sound her designer pumps made with each step. As she reached the gate, she turned back with the dramatic flair she'd perfected during countless HOA board meetings. "This isn't over. I'll be reviewing every single one of your permits, Jim Henderson. Every single one." The gate slammed behind her with a satisfying bang, though the effect was somewhat diminished by the fact that she immediately had to ring the doorbell because the gate only opened from the inside. As Karen drove home in her Mercedes, air conditioning on full blast and seat covers protecting her leather from pool water, she was already planning her next move. The Hendersons thought they'd won, but they clearly didn't understand who they were dealing with. She'd been protecting this neighborhood's standards long before they'd moved in with their overly friendly attitude and their suspiciously well-maintained landscaping. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant HOA board member, Margaret. "Emergency board meeting tonight. The Henderson situation has escalated." Karen smiled. Finally, someone understood the gravity of the situation. By 7 p.m. that evening, Karen had transformed her soggy morning adventure into a heroic tale of community service. She'd changed into her most authoritative pantsuit, printed out 17 pages of pool maintenance regulations she'd found on various municipal websites, and prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled "The Henderson Health Crisis, a Case Study in Negligent Pool Ownership." She arrived at the community center 20 minutes early, as was her custom, and began arranging chairs in what she called her authority formation, a semicircle that positioned her at the focal point. Margaret arrived next, followed by the other board members: Bob Chen, retired accountant and chronic fence height measurer; Linda Rodriguez, whose primary qualification was an encyclopedic knowledge of lawn care violations; and David Park, who mostly attended meetings for the free coffee and donuts. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Karen began, clicking to her first slide. "What happened this morning was a perfect example of why this board exists. The Henderson family has created a clear and present danger to our community's health and property values." Margaret, who'd been unusually quiet, cleared her throat. "Karen, I've seen the video." Karen blinked. "What video?" "The Hendersons posted it on the neighborhood Facebook group. You, climbing out of their pool, in your work clothes." Margaret's voice carried the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Karen Whitfield, stood waist-deep in her neighbor's pool at 6:47 a.m., fully clothed in her power suit, clutching a pH testing kit like it was evidence in a murder trial. Water dripped from her blazer as she held up a vial of pool water, squinting at it with the intensity of a scientist discovering a new element. "Aha!" she shouted to no one in particular, completely oblivious to the security camera recording her every move from 3 different angles. 30 minutes earlier, Karen had jimmied open the Hendersons' back gate with a credit card, a skill she'd learned from a YouTube video titled Emergency Home Entry Techniques that she'd bookmarked for HOA emergencies. She'd convinced herself this wasn't breaking and entering. It was community wellness inspection, a term she'd invented the night before while pacing her living room in silk pajamas, clutching a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. The third shocking moment came when she spotted what she was looking for, a small green tinge near the pool's filtration system. "Algae," she gasped, pulling out her phone to document the violation. As she leaned forward for the perfect evidence shot, her designer handbag slipped off her shoulder and plunged into the chlorinated depths with a satisfying splash. Karen's face contorted through 5 stages of grief in rapid succession before settling on righteous indignation. "This pool is clearly a health hazard," she declared to that underwater coach bag. Karen had been HOA president for 3 years, ever since she'd run unopposed on a platform of maintaining excellence through vigilant oversight. What started as a desire to keep property values high had evolved into something resembling a medieval fiefdom, with Karen as both judge and executioner of suburban infractions. Her neighbors had learned to fear the sound of her heels clicking down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, like some sort of bureaucratic grim reaper. The Henderson pool situation had been festering in Karen's mind for weeks. She'd noticed the family had been hosting friends more frequently, and while there was technically nothing in the HOA rules about pool parties, Karen was convinced they were operating some sort of unlicensed recreational facility. The green tint she'd spotted through their fence the previous evening was the smoking gun she'd been waiting for. "Mrs. Whitfield?" Karen spun around, water sloshing, to find 16-year-old Tommy Henderson standing in the doorway to his house, still in his pajamas, holding a bowl of cereal. His expression suggested he was either still dreaming or had finally lost his grip on reality. "Tommy." Karen beamed, as if she'd been invited for an early morning swim. "Perfect timing. I was just conducting a routine pool inspection and discovered a serious algae situation. Your parents will need to address this immediately." Tommy blinked slowly. "You're in our pool, in your work clothes." "Health violations wait for no one," Karen replied, attempting to climb out gracefully, but succeeding only in creating a small tsunami that soaked Tommy's bare feet. "I'll need you to sign this violation notice." She reached into her soggy blazer and produced a laminated form, somehow still dry. Tommy stared at it like she'd handed him a live scorpion. "I'm not signing anything. You broke into our yard. I performed an emergency inspection based on reasonable suspicion of code violations." Karen corrected, wringing out her sleeves. "It's all perfectly legal under Section 4.7 of the HOA Charter. That's not a real thing. Everything I do is authorized by the Homeowners Association," Karen said, her voice taking on the tone she used during heated board meetings. "I suggest you wake your parents so we can discuss remediation immediately." Tommy stepped backward. "I'm calling the cops." Karen laughed. "It sounded like a smoke detector with a dying battery." "The police?" "Tommy, I am the authority here. I'm trying to protect this community from health hazards and property devaluation. Your pool could single-handedly destroy our neighborhood's reputation." But Tommy had already disappeared inside, and Karen could hear muffled shouting from within the house. She looked around the backyard, suddenly aware of how her situation might appear to someone lacking proper context. Her designer suit clung to her like a second skin, her hair had escaped its usual helmet-like precision, and she was standing next to a pool that, in the morning light, looked significantly less green than it had through the fence slats at dusk. The back door burst open and Jim Henderson appeared, a large man in a bathrobe who looked like he bench-pressed refrigerators for fun. Behind him stood his wife Sarah, recording everything on her phone, and Tommy, now very much awake and grinning. "I'll handle the Henderson situation personally," she said finally. Board meeting adjourned. She gathered her PowerPoint materials and walked out, leaving 4 board members staring after her in bewildered silence. Driving home, Karen's mind raced through damage control scenarios. She could claim the gate was unlocked. She could argue that the pool really had been green earlier. She could insist that her actions were justified by genuine health concerns. But as she pulled into her driveway, she saw Jim Henderson waiting on her front porch, no longer wearing a bathrobe. He looked like a man who'd spent the day talking to lawyers. "We need to talk," he said simply. Karen felt her pulse quicken, but her HOA instincts kicked in. "If this is about the pool maintenance violation, it's about you breaking into my property and the fact that my 15-year-old daughter was home alone when you did it." She was scared, Karen. A strange adult picked the lock to our yard and was in our pool when she got up for school. The information hit Karen like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her role as community protector that she hadn't considered how her actions might affect the people she claimed to be protecting. The image of a teenage girl being frightened by her pool inspection suddenly made her morning's adventure look very different. "I didn't know anyone else was home," she said quietly. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't know. You made assumptions, ignored laws, and scared my family." Jim's voice was controlled but firm. "The police want to press charges. My lawyer says we have grounds for harassment and property damage. Your shoes scratched our pool deck." Karen looked down at her feet, remembering the satisfying click of her heels as she'd made her dramatic exit. Those clicks had apparently left permanent marks on expensive stonework. "What do you want?" she asked, the fight suddenly draining out of her. "I want you to resign as HOA president tonight. And I want a formal apology to my family, not just for today, but for 3 years of making this neighborhood feel like a police state." Karen felt 20 years of suburban authority crumbling. "And if I don't, then we'll let the lawyers and the local news station sort it out. Your choice." As Jim walked away, Karen stood in her driveway, still damp from her morning swim, holding 17 pages of pool regulations that suddenly seemed completely pointless. Her phone buzzed with notifications, more comments on the Facebook video, a missed call from Channel 7, a text from her real estate agent asking if the HOA controversy would affect her property value. For the first time in 3 years, Karen Whitfield wasn't sure what her next move should be. But as she watched Jim Henderson's porch light come on across the street, she realized that her next decision might be the most important one she'd ever made as a neighbor, not as an HOA president, but as a human being who'd lost sight of the difference between protecting a community and terrorizing it. The security cameras had indeed caught everything. The question now was what story the next chapter would tell. Bob Chen pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward Karen. The video, shot in crisp high definition, showed her spectacular exit from the pool, complete with her dramatic speech about health violations and property values. The caption read, "When your HOA president mistakes Dawn Shadow for algae and your pool for public property. #OGoneWorld, #Pool Patrol, #Security Cameras Work." Karen watched herself on the tiny screen, seeing for the first time how her emergency inspection actually looked. The woman in the video appeared unhinged, ranting about microscopic algae while dripping pool water and clutching a pH testing kit like a weapon. The video had 847 views and 73 comments, none of which appeared to be supportive. "This is obviously taken out of context," Karen said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "They've edited it to make my legitimate health inspection look unreasonable." Linda leaned forward. "Karen, there's also security footage from their cameras. Multiple angles. It shows you picking their gate lock with a credit card at 6:15 a.m. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Karen's world crashing down around her. She'd built her HOA presidency on the foundation of absolute authority and moral superiority. The idea that she could be wrong, publicly, embarrassingly wrong, had never entered her strategic planning. The pool was a health hazard, she insisted, though even she could hear how hollow it sounded. David Park, who rarely spoke during meetings, looked up from his phone. Karen, I live 2 houses down from the Hendersons. Their pool guy comes every Wednesday. That water is cleaner than most drinking water. Karen felt something unfamiliar creeping up her spine. The cold realization that she might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. But 3 years of unchallenged authority had built defensive mechanisms stronger than her capacity for self-reflection. Then obviously they cleaned it after I discovered the violation, she said. Classic cover-up behavior. Margaret stood up, and Karen recognized the body language of someone who'd reached their limit. The police were called, Karen. Jim Henderson is considering pressing charges for breaking and entering. That's ridiculous. I have full authority to. No, you don't. Bob Chen's voice cut through her protest with the precision of someone who'd spent 40 years reading fine print. I've reviewed our actual HOA charter, not the expanded version you've been citing for 3 years. We have no authority to enter private property for inspections. None. We never did. Karen's carefully constructed world began to fracture. But Section 4.7 clearly states. Section 4.7 is about mailbox placement, Linda interrupted. I looked it up during lunch break. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen looked around the room at faces that had supported her through 3 years of increasingly aggressive neighborhood management. Now they looked embarrassed, uncomfortable, and worst of all, disappointed. The Facebook video has been shared to 3 other neighborhood groups. Margaret continued gently. Channel 7 News called the Hendersons this afternoon. This could become a much bigger problem. Karen's phone buzzed with a text message. Mrs. Whitfield, this is Officer Martinez with Maplewood Police. We need to speak with you regarding the incident at 847 Elm Street this morning. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. She stared at the message, realizing that her morning's adventure had consequences she hadn't anticipated. In her mind, she'd been a community guardian, protecting property values and public health. But the evidence, videos, witnesses, police involvement, painted a very different picture. I think, Bob said carefully, we need to discuss whether this board should formally apologize to the Henderson family. Karen's head snapped up. Apologize? For protecting this community? For breaking into their backyard and trespassing in their pool? David corrected matter-of-factly. The word trespassing hit Karen like cold pool water. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as the neighborhood's protector that she'd lost sight of basic legal boundaries. But admitting fault felt like abandoning everything she'd built.